Good evening, everyone. It's so good to see each and every one of you tonight. Please take your Bibles and turn to Second Kings chapter 4. 2 Kings chapter 4. And so as we're continuing on with our study through the prophets, we're looking at lesson 8, Elisha, part 2. And I'm going to say the same thing that I said when we started lesson 7, Elisha, part 1. At some point, I'm going to say Elijah for Elisha. It's just going to happen. So just listen carefully for context to see who it is. We talked about Elijah for 2 weeks and talked about how Elijah was called by God to help stand in the gap in the encroaching Baal worship. And so through King Ahab and through apostasy, it already started to work its way in. But when Ahab married Jezebel, who was a princess from Tyre, she brought Baal worship. Baal was the chief Canaanite god with her to Israel, and it began to spread very rapidly. And so God calls up Elijah to be a prophet to condemn this rising Baal worship in the nation of Israel. And then Elijah does this for many years, and then he is taken up into heaven in a whirlwind, and that leaves his son in the faith, if you will. Elisha calls him father when he's taken up in heaven. It's not his biological father, but Elijah went and called Elisha when he was a teenager, his early 20s at the oldest, and is with him for several years during that time frame where he sees Elijah and he sees him stand up to King Ahab and he sees him stand up to Ahaziah. And so when God calls Elijah up into heaven, Elisha takes the mantle. And we talked about several things last week, or really 2 weeks ago, I guess, because we had our Thanksgiving service last week, about the prophet Elisha. And we talked about how it's interesting because he asked for a double portion of Elijah's spirit. And the Bible actually records about 18 wonders that he works, twice as many as Elijah. And so Elisha really is the wonder-working prophet. I mean, he's the one that does the most miraculous things of any prophet that we have. And we talked about several of those in our part 1. If you missed that, I highly encourage you to go back and look at part 1. And we're going to be continuing on this evening with part 2. And so some of the wonders that Elijah did that we can see in the text are pretty incredible, and they're given very few information as far as the miraculous of it. In 2 Kings chapter 4, verses 38 to 41, an interesting thing that keeps on popping up in the life of Elisha. Elisha appears to be over the sons of the prophets. Now, the Bible doesn't really give us an explanation of how that relationship was. All we can see is that some have tried to figure out what it is. Is it a school of prophets? Are they training under him? Are they just his servants? Like, what exactly is going on there? Text doesn't tell us. But what is pretty easy to see is that there are those who answer to Elisha, whether they're his servants, whether they're his students. The text doesn't really make it very clear, but they are individuals who listen to him, and why not? He's the premier prophet of Israel. And so, and he tells the servants to go in to make a stew, and there's a famine going on. And so they're looking for things they wouldn't normally use in their food. And so one of the servants finds a vine with some gourds growing on it. He takes those gourds and he throws in the stew for them to eat because it's a famine. And they start eating the stew and they start getting sick. And they're like, oh, there's death in that pot, right? And so Elijah takes some meal, some flour, and throws it in the pot and neutralizes the poison, right? And they're able to eat that, which is kind of interesting. A really, really cool one takes place immediately afterwards is the feeding of the 100 with 20 loaves. And so a man comes and he's got 20 loaves and a few heads of grain, and there's 100 men who are there. And if they had appetites like mine, 20 loaves aren't going to, I mean, that's one loaf is an appetizer for one guy before a meal, right? So 20 loaves don't feed 20 guys who are hungry in the midst of a famine. And so Elisha tells his servant to break the loaves and start passing it out, right? It's very, very familiar to Matthew chapter 14, Matthew 15, what Jesus does to the 4,000 and the 5,000. But what is interesting here is that when he tells them to break the loaves and start passing it out, the servant's like, there's not enough food here to feed 100 guys. And he says, just do it. He starts breaking the loaves and he starts passing it out, and it feeds all 100, and they have some left over. And so they see that as being like miraculous. 20 loaves, 100 guys. Jesus feeds 4,000 people with 7 loaves. 4,000 people with 7 loaves. If that's not impressive enough, then he feeds 5,000 people with 5 loaves. More people, less loaves, right? And so you hear the servants are shocked that Elisha can feed 100 with 20. Jesus feeds, combined 9,000 with a combined loaf total of 12, and so, pretty, it just it magnifies just how more incredible Jesus's actions were in Matthew 14 and 15 compared to that of Elijah at 2 Kings chapter 4. And then we can see a few chapters later in 2 Kings chapter 6, the floating axe head. The servants tell Elisha, they're like, hey, we need a bigger house. Like our living quarters in your service are too cramped. Can we please go down to the Jordan River where there's some big trees and cut those big trees down and make us a bigger lodging house for us? Elijah says, sure, fine. That's fine. They said, will you come with us? He's like, okay, sure. So he goes down there and they're cutting trees. And while they're cutting trees and the guy's swinging the axe, the head of the axe flies off and goes to the Jordan River. And it sinks down to the bottom. And the servant says, oh, my Lord, it was borrowed, right? Who's been there? You ever borrowed something from somebody and broke it? It's like, I'm going to have to pay for it. And I'm going to be embarrassed now because I broke their stuff. And so the guy's like, it was borrowed, and so Elijah takes a tree and takes a stick and cuts a stick and throws it in the water. And this, bronze, maybe axe head, maybe stone, floats out of the water and they retrieve it. And so, I mean, if you're familiar with the story, it's not impressive. But you hear this for the first time, like that doesn't happen on a density level. You know what I'm saying? Like that stuff just doesn't happen. But with the prophet of God or with God's power, all those things happen. And so any comments or any questions on any of those 3 wonders that take place with Elijah? With iron. And so there you go. And last time I checked, iron doesn't float unless it's made in a boat or a ship, which blows my mind anyways. But this particular piece of iron did not float before Elijah threw stick in. Good comments. This is a very important map, and I want you to look at it carefully because it's going to be very important for the rest of our class. The blue part is Israel. Okay, by this time, the nations have already been split. Okay, so the northern region, you have Israel. This is where Elijah and Elisha live. They were prophets in the northern kingdom. All right, the yellow portion there, that is the kingdom of Judah. Okay, and so both these nations attribute their founding back to David, really to Saul and to David and to Solomon, but they've been split. If you can look carefully, directly underneath Judah is the kingdom of Edom. Those are the descendants of Esau. Okay, right on the other side of the Dead Sea from Judah, that is the kingdom of Moab, right? Those are the descendants of Lot. Okay, if you can look up and right above Moab, there's the kingdom of Ammon. That's going to be very important for us tonight. But above that, you're going to see the kingdom of Aram or Damascus, also Syria. So in our text, sometimes it's called Aram, sometimes it's called Syria. Don't be confused. It's the same place, same kingdom. And I'm probably going to call it Syria the entire time just for clarity and continuity. Okay, so very important for our next. Because if you see Moab right there, Moab was a vassal kingdom of Israel. What that means is a vassal kingdom, which was extremely common in the ancient world, is you get to be king and you get to rule your people as long as you pay me homage and give me some money, right? So who's the real power? Israel is, right? But the king of Moab can still be called a king. He can still live in the palace. He can still boss his people around. Like Israel's like, we don't really care what you do as long as you bring in the tribute, right? Very common throughout the ancient world, right? And every empire had vassal kingdoms, the Persians, the Romans, all kinds of stuff. So Moab, let me back up just a little bit. Okay, the king of Israel dies. Okay, the king of Israel dies, and his son Jehoram becomes king of Israel. Okay, and so Moab, Mesha, who's the king of Moab, says, this young guy is king now. It's probably a good time for me to rebel, right? Because he may be weak. There may be a power struggle going on for who's going to be the next king. They may be too busy to care about me. They were supposed to give him Moab was supposed to give Israel 100,000 sheep and the wool of 100,000 rams. There's a lot of wool, a lot of sheep, right? But they rebel. And so Jehoshaphat is the king of Judah, okay? And so Jehoshaphat, his son, marries Ahab's daughter, okay? So the king of Judah, his daughter-in-law, is the sister of the new king of Israel. Does that make sense? Everybody clear on that? Okay, just making sure. Okay. And so okay, like Andy Brothers is here. Okay. Let's say Andy Brothers is the king, all right, of Judah. Y'all got that? All right. And Corley, she would be the sister to the king of Israel, right? And so Hunter's the prince in waiting, right? But even though Andy feels like if Corley's brother gets into a fight, he's probably got to help, right? Because that's his daughter-in-law's brother. Does that make sense? Is that cool? It helps clear my mind up. Maybe I just made it more weird. It doesn't matter. Okay. And so because Israel and Judah have been fighting, I mean, Israel and Judah have been fighting for the last 100 years, right? There's been occasions where they fought together, right, against Syria or somebody else. But in the next few chapters, we're going to see that they're a lot more closer. And you're like, what happened? Why is Judah and Israel no longer fighting each other? But for the next few chapters, they're always fighting with each other. Well, it's because they've intermarried, right? The royal families have become combined. So that's an important aspect. And so Israel says, Judah, I want you to fight with me. They say, all right, we'll fight with you. And then they say, hey, Edom, we want you to fight with us too, which is also weird because Edom is also a territory that fights with these guys from time to time. But they're all going to gang up and go and fight against Moab and take some of their stuff. And if you can align and take somebody else's stuff, that's a pretty, solid glue that holds people together. And so they make an alliance and they decide that instead of coming down from Israel on the north side of the Dead Sea, because that's where they're going to be expecting us to come, we're going to get real cute, and we're going to go the long way around the Dead Sea and go through the land of Edom and come in the back way. They'll never be expecting us, and we're going to have them. There's only a problem. They go around the Dead Sea. Can they get water from the Dead Sea? Why not? It's a sea. It's too salty, right? But that's okay because there are springs and creeks, or if you're from Alaska, creeks. But anyways, there's creeks in that area. It's like, it's fine. Like we'll go to those creeks, we'll get water. There's a problem. They go that way and there's no water. All the oases are dry. All the creeks are dry. All the freshwater springs are dry. Like the water's gone. Miraculously, there's no water. There's always water here. There's no water. And so then they start saying, this is something God has done. Like God is punishing us for attacking Moab. This is something that Yahweh has done. And Jehoshaphat, who's a pretty good king, right? A pretty faithful king. Jehoshaphat says, is there a prophet of God here? Do we have one? And one of the servants says, Elijah's with us, which begs the question, why is Elisha with the army? I have no idea, but he's there for some reason. And so they call Elisha up and they say, Elisha, like, why is God taking the water away? Like what's going on here? And Elijah says, I'll tell you what's going to happen. Oh no, Elijah, let me back up a little bit. It's really interesting because Elijah, the kings come to Elisha and, and they're like, hey, Elisha, can you help us out? And Elisha says, I'll tell you what, I'll help you out only because of Jehoshaphat, right? Because he looks at Jehoram and says, like, you're a dog, like, and your mom and your dad brought this Baal worship into here and you're still worshiping Baal. And why don't you just go ask one of the prophets of Baal to help you out? And he's like, no, this is something that God has done. We need God to fix it. Right. And so Elisha kind of blasts Jehoram a little bit for not taking a stand against the idol worship of his, because Jezebel's still alive. Ahab has died. Jezebel's still around being a queen mother, right? Influencing, keeping the prophets of Baal on the royal payroll. And so Elijah says, just go ask one of them to help you out. They're like, no, you help us. He says, I wouldn't even look at you, but since Jehoshaphat is here, I'll help you guys out. Tomorrow, you're going to have water, but there's going to be no rain and no wind. Now, this is very important. Why would it be very important for water to appear for the army who hasn't had water in 7 days with no rain and no wind. This is where you got to really think back to some of the stuff we've been talking about in our previous classes. He said, why don't you ask the prophets of Baal? Baal is the god of rain. So if Jehovah sends rain, what could the Baal worshiper say? Baal sent it. We've been praying to Baal for the last 7 days. It's just coincidence you asked Elijah the day before it came. But if Elijah says, oh, I'll get you some water. No rain, though. Isn't that harder? What's harder for somebody to say to somebody? It's going to rain tomorrow and you'll have water, or there'll be enough water for everybody. There'll be no rain. Yeah. What is harder, right? But guess what? The next day, there's water, right? It just comes up from the ground, and those springs and those creeks, those things, there's water there for the army. The interesting thing is you have the army of Moab, who has now redirected and went south to intercept the army of Israel and Judah, and it hasn't rained. But there's water. And the sun is coming up, and they're in a deserted place. So when the sun comes up and the sun hits that water, it looks red because they're in a desert. And so the Moabites think that it's blood. And they think that typically the Edomites, the Israelites, and the Judeans hate each other, and they've been fighting for the last 150 years. They've all got together with no water, and they're all cranky and ornery, and they're fighting each other. This is their blood, so let's go and attack. So the Moabites think it's blood, looking at it from afar, get down there, and they just get wiped out. They get wiped out. They're driven all the way back to the capital city, and as they're going back, in the ancient world, like 95% of casualties take place when your line is breaking and you're retreating, right? It's the most dangerous part of ancient warfare is when your line is broke. That's what hold the line comes from, right? Because as long as you hold the line, you got a chance. If you break, there's no chance at all. They just mow you down. And so they're fleeing. They're getting mowed down. They're torching their crops. They're burning their villages. They're taking stones and rocking their fields. If they'd been from Marshall County, they just got dairy cows, right? But they're from Marshall County. So they rock all their fields, and they get back to the gates of the capital city. And it's there that Misha does something drastic. He takes his son and his heir, and he sacrifices him to Chemosh, which is the god of the Moabites, who did sacrifices, particularly child sacrifices, was the way they worshipped Chemosh and Moab. And God talks about the abomination of the Moabites in various places in the Old Testament. But after he sacrifices his son, they really just kind of leave him alone and go back to Israel. And this is actually recorded on the Moabite stone. And so this is a stone that was written sometime probably around 875 BC. It's one of the oldest stones that we have. And so pretty important archaeological find for that. Okay. Any questions about the rebellion of Moab or comments? Todd?
There's still work that had to be done by people.
Mm-hmm.
God was going to do the hard part, but there was still work they had to do. So, situation. Elisha said, "Hey, you guys got to go out and you got to dig ditches all throughout the valley to collect all this water that's coming."
Mm-hmm.
It wasn't like they just got to sit and God did everything. They had to do work.
Yeah. Well, it's like you were saying, every time, when God tells Noah, I'm going to save you and your family, what did Noah have to do? Build a boat, right? And so, or an ark boat, but like you're saying, all these, you can just go down the line, through the list of when God tells you, I'm going to do this for you. There's always something, right, that's attached that we have to do as an act of faith. So good comment. Good. Anyone else? Great. And so then we had the cleansing of Naaman, right? Great baptism sermon, right? 1 Kings 5. He's a leper. He is a general of the army of Aram, Syria, right? Now, Syria is an up-and-coming kingdom. They're going to become extremely important. This is where Antioch and Damascus is going to be extremely important during the Persian Empire, the Greek Empire, the Roman Empire. Antioch is going to be basically built there, where in this area. And so in 1 Kings 5, he's a great general, but he has leprosy. And so he's got leprosy, and a servant girl of Israel who's been carried off by a raid. Remember, these guys are fighting constantly back and forth. And this girl's an Israelite who's been taken captive by a raid of the Syrians. And she says, there's a prophet in Israel who can heal you. And so Naaman goes to the king and says, I want to go into Israel, because this is foreign territory. Like this is enemy territory, okay? So he's got to have approval from the king before he can go into the enemy's territory. So the king writes him a letter to the king of Israel, Jehoram, for him to be healed of leprosy. Jehoram gets the letter, and he tears his clothes. It's like, am I God that I can cleanse somebody of leprosy? And so he thinks that this is like a ploy to start an act of war. And so he's really upset. Elijah knows this through inspiration, most likely, sends a message to the king and says, send him to me. I'll take care of him. And so he brings, $1.5 million of modern day money with him. He brings 10 changes of clothing, and he brings 150 pounds of gold, which is worth $3.9 million. Oh, that's not right. My thing's not right. That should be, yeah. So, well, that's not the only thing that's wrong. 2 Kings 5. Good catch, Mark. Keep me on your toes tonight. I'm impressed with Mark. I'm very disappointed in the rest of y'all. About 175 of y'all slipping. Okay. Yeah. You're just being too nice, right, Miss Lisa? And so that's why you have elders, right? To tell you the things that are, they're not worried about being too. Okay. And so 2 Kings chapter 5, right? No, it's also wrong too. I got $1.5 million. It should be like 4.1, because he brings $3.9 million of modern gold, 150 pounds. And he brings 750 pounds of silver, which is worth about $206,000 in today's money. And so he goes to Naaman, and Naaman goes to Elisha. Elisha doesn't even get out of the house. He sends Gehazi out the door to tell Naaman what he's supposed to do. He's supposed to go dip 7 times in the Jordan River. And he's like, what? I came all this way for this false prophet to tell me to go wash in the Jordan River 7 times. It's not even a clean river. It's not big. It's not clean. It's not impressive. I could have dipped in the rivers back home, right? And so he's mad and ready to go home. And one of his servants says, my Lord, if he told you something great, you'd have done it. Just give it a shot, man. And so they go to the Jordan River. He dips 7 times. The 7th time he comes up, and it says his flesh is restored like that of a baby, right? And he's so excited, and he's so humbled, he's so gracious, that he goes back to Elijah's house. Okay, making sure I'm not reading too far ahead. So he goes back to Elisha's house, and he thanks him. And then we have 2 Kings chapter 5, where Naaman is trying to give the goods to Elisha, and he's like, "No, I'm not taking any of your goods. It's not why I do what I do." And so Naaman insists. He asks for 2 cartloads of dirt to take it back with him, so he can build an altar to the Lord on land there in Israel. In the ancient world, the idea of deity being tied to location is extremely powerful. So in his pagan mind, he's thinking, I need to take some land back from Israel so I can make an altar, because I know now there's only one God in all the world, and that God is Jehovah or Yahweh. And so he asked for 2 cartloads of dirt, and he leaves, and Gehazi sees him leaving, and so he runs, and he asks for 1 talent of silver and 2 changes of clothes. And Naaman is like more than happy. He says, take 2 talents. He's like, here's 2 changes of clothing and take 2 talents. Gehazi lies, because he says there's been 2 more additions to the school, right? 2 more sons of the prophets have now come to live with us, and they don't have any money or clothes. So can you provide for us? He's like, yeah, you've asked for 1 talent, take 2 talents. And here's 2 changes of clothing. A talent is 75 pounds. And so it's 150 pounds of silver. And so Naaman actually has to send guys with him to bring back the silver back there. So he brings it back, he hides it. Then 2 Kings 5:25 through 27, it says this: Gehazi went in and stood before his master, and Elisha said to him, "Where have you been, Gehazi?" And he said, "Your servant went nowhere." But he said to him, "Did not my heart go when the man turned from his chariot to meet you? Was it a time to accept money and garments, olive orchards and vineyards, sheep and oxen, male servants and female servants? Therefore, the leprosy of Naaman shall cling to you and your descendants forever." So he went out from his presence, a leper like snow. And so the interesting thing is that in 2 Kings chapter 8, Gehazi is talking to the king of Israel. And so it makes you wonder if things are written chronologically, or if his leprosy was a certain type that that came and went at different times. I mean, there's a lot of questions that come up with the end of chapter 5. And it says it stuck to him in a sentence forever. And then in chapter 8, you got him giving a message to the king. If he was a leper, and I guess he was in a leprous state, he wouldn't have been able to be in the presence of the king. So it's interesting, right? Two things, potentially, right? That he was either healed at some point, or that it's not written chronologically, which if it's not really a big deal. Because it seems like if you read 1st and 2nd Kings, especially the life of Elijah, things seem to be grouped according to category and not according to time, if that makes sense. And so, good. Any questions or comments about Naaman? Todd?
I had a question. When Naaman asked for the 2 mules worth of dirt,
Mm-hmm.
he said something I found interesting. I always wondered about it. He said the Lord pardoned him when he goes to the house of Bourne
Mm-hmm.
and bows there. So is that like their temple?
Mm-hmm.
Is that like the God of Syria? So when he goes in there and he does the homage to there,
Yeah.
he's really not doing homage to there. He really knows that God is God.
Yeah. He talks about having to go in and having to extend his arm for the king to like bow down and grab his arm. He says when he does that, I have to bow a little bit. Don't hold that against me. And Elijah says, "Go in peace." And so it seems that he's got clearance on that. He's not worshiping or paying homage. He's just, fulfilling a job requirement, I guess you would say. So it is an interesting dynamic, right? So it's good. I don't know if that's an answer, but
I was just always curious about it. It's one of the few places where you have one who was a pagan actually trying to be proselytized, if you will.
yeah,
And his job is putting him in a situation that he's basically saying, I'm really not doing what people think I'm doing.
yeah, exactly, yeah. And so it is interesting, but he's like, he knows that he's not a god, right? And I'm not bowing. I'm just have to go in the temple because I'm the commander of the army, So it's a good question. Good. Yes, Tim.
How much do you think Naaman knew about Elisha before he went there? Because you have this slave girl basically saying, "Hey, there's a prophet that could heal him," but then you have the king sending word to the king.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know. King of Syria thought, "Hey, he's just kind of on your payroll. You,
Yeah.
hey, give me a miracle. On behalf of this guy." And
Yeah.
he does it. Works for you rather than God. But it just seems like, as you look at him getting angry about the fact that, I thought he would come out and do some visible thing, and it almost seems like, if some girl said, "Hey, there's a prophet, tell me more about it." And you have all these things like when he takes the oil and he allows the one woman to multiply and use it and sell it. And then he had, the widow or the Shunammite woman's son, brings him back from the dead. So there's all these things. And so I just kind of wonder, how much did this girl tell about that?
Yeah.
It plays into the fact that when he gets there, he's all excited. Not only am I going to get healed, but I'm going to see some kind of visible miracle. Not only does he not see that, but he doesn't even come out.
Yeah.
Hey, just go tell him to do this, and he's so mad he's going to go back and just die a leper. I just wonder how much he heard because I think you had on one of your slides. He's a lot like Jesus. They're very parallel between the miracles he did and miracles of Jesus. And, during his ministry, the crowds have followed him because of what they heard of him doing. Word had to spread beyond just, the local scene there about what he was doing. So I kind of wonder how much of that play into his anger.
Probably a little bit. I'd say, of course, we don't know what the young girl said, but I think probably his own previous experiences, because in the ancient world with shamans and prophets and stuff like that, it's very going back to Mount Carmel, in 1 Kings 17, it says they cut themselves, and make this big theater, this big theatrical thing, as was their custom, where whenever you see the prophets of Yahweh, they're very anticlimactic, right? Because this is something God's going to do. I don't have to wail, and conjure up. I don't have to conjure him up, or this is what's going to happen, And so I think it may have been maybe a little bit of both. His expectation probably born more so of what he had experienced in his own pagan, ancient Near Eastern religious cults. And I think that's an important lesson too, because how many people in today's are like Naaman. They have a preconception of religion or what religion is supposed to be because of what they've been exposed to. And then they hear the simplicity of the gospel, and it's like, well, that can't be right. That's not how it works. It's like, well, is it not how it works, or is it not how you anticipated it working? Because those are not the same thing. Jim? Yeah, we don't have any indication that he did go back and try different waters, but he did say that it would be better for me to use these other rivers that are cleaner, right, closer to home. I could have saved myself, a 2-week journey here and a 2-week journey back, however long it took him to go. And so, but I do think there's a lot of parallels between. That's why you've heard that sermon preached, right? Because there are so many good parallels between Naaman's cleansing of the leprosy and our cleansing through baptism, right? I mean, both are being baptized, literally, to dip himself, right? And the word baptizo in the Greek really means to dip or to immerse. And so, yeah, Todd.
I would have thought though, by Elisha not coming out and not doing anything big and telling him to go to the Jordan River and do all this, if you would have, he's putting before Naaman, hey, when you get done, you're not going. There's going to be no doubt in your mind. It was God who healed you because you didn't see me.
Yeah.
You didn't hear from me.
Yeah.
You're going somewhere that you've already in your mind despised.
Yeah.
And there's no cleansing properties associated with the word ever.
Mm-hmm.
And so when Naaman goes, and he came out the first time, and he's like, okay, and the seventh time it comes out, it's like it removes all doubt.
Could you imagine his mind at the 6th dip? Because at that time, it wasn't like it was a gradual thing. It wasn't like, he was a little bit cleansed on the first dip, a little bit cleansed on dip number 2. And he's like, oh, this is working, Could you imagine his mind after number 6? It's like, this stupid prophet made me look like an idiot in front of all my guys. I mean, all the guys that he commands. For those of you in positions of authority, right? I mean, you don't look stupid for the guys you boss around, right? And so I wonder how much his mind changed, or his attitude, or what was going through his mind, between dip 6 and dip 7. I think it'd be, and it's like you were saying, the emphasis is on God, because when he gets up out of the water, he doesn't say, now I know there's a prophet in Israel. He says, now I know there's a God, right? Only one God in the world. Dylan?
I think it shows the impact of what people around you bring. He wouldn't have done it without his servants.
Yeah.
If he didn't have the servants there, he would have just went home and stayed a leper for the rest of his life. So it shows, what is the company that you keep with you? Are they the ones who are going to make you better? Or are they the ones who are going to let you just go on?
Yeah. Or like you were saying, there was evidently Naaman was a good guy, right? Because his servant, I read a lesson one time. I didn't hear the lesson. I read a lesson on the servant girl, the Israelite servant girl. This was a girl who was taken against her will in a military campaign, living in a city that she didn't want to live in a house that she was subjected to slavery. And through her actions, Naaman became a believer in Yahweh, right? Because she sought his benefit and not her own. And the sermon was about, even when we find ourselves in difficult situations or situations we don't want, you can still make an impact. Number one, for God's glory. And number two, to help somebody in that situation, bring somebody to in our situation, to bring them to Christ, right? Their situation, bring them to God. I thought, man, that's a good sermon. I'm going to preach that here one day. I haven't preached it yet, but you got a little foretaste, right, of about 30-minute session of that. But yeah, no, I think so too. It's great point. Good. All right. I think we can do one more. Oh yeah, and jump in afterwards. It's like, I've got a bad foot. Like, I'm gonna jump in here real quick, see what happens. And so we've got Elisha's knowledge, and this is a pretty cool story from 2 Kings chapter 6. Pretty well-known story. Aram, also known as Syria, was a neighbor of Israel north. That's where Naaman is from. We're not really sure what the difference in time is. There are a lot of raids, a lot of conflicts back and forth. And so during this time, the king of Syria, right, is leading raids into Israel. It's kind of interesting to think about it, because if this is around Naaman's time frame, guess who's one of the commanders of the army of Syria leading raids into Israel? Naaman. So it's just kind of interesting when we think about it, right? Now it's hard to tell. We don't know. 2 Kings 6 could be before 2 Kings 5, right? We just don't know. And so, but anyways, either way, there's a pretty high probability that one of these commanders in this raid is Naaman, which is really interesting when you think about that, whether it's before or after his proselytizing. And so, and a proselytizing is a college word that means conversion. And so Syria is trying to make raids into Israel, but every time they try to make a raid into Israel, like the Israelites are like 2 steps ahead. And it's got to the point now where the king of Syria thinks there's a spy in his inner circle, right? Which, if this is after the whole Naaman thing, that would be kind of interesting. If he knows Naaman's been down there, has been cleansed of leprosy, and now he thinks there's a spy. And one of his servants says, and this is also interesting, that one of the servants of the king in the inner circle says, "Lord, there's no spy. It's Elijah, the prophet." This is a foreign nation, right? These aren't Israelites. These are foreigners, right? And the foreigners tell the king, "No, it's Elijah." In fact, Elijah knows everything that you say. Even when you go into your bedroom and shut the door, he knows it all, right? And so what does the king do? He sends an army to go and get Elijah. He says that Elijah's at Dothan, so he sends an army to encircle the city. They encircle the city. Everybody's going crazy, right? Because the army of Syria is here, and they've come to arrest Elijah. In 2 Kings chapter 6, verses 16 through 18, it says this. Elijah said, "Do not be afraid, for those who are with us are more than those who are with them." Then Elisha prayed and said, "O Lord, please open his eyes that he may see." Talking about his servant. So the Lord opened the eyes of the young man, and he saw, and behold, the mountain was full of horses and chariots of fire all around Elisha. And when the Syrians came down against him, Elisha prayed to the Lord and said, "Please strike them with blindness." So he struck them with blindness in accordance with the prayer of Elisha. And so, I mean, think about the fear, right? You're in this city. It's probably got some walls or something around it. You've got the army of Syria, of the Syrians, who's encircled around the city, right? And Elijah is just cool, calm, and collected. And his servant's like, why are you so calm? And he opens his eyes and he can see all the angelic hosts around this, encompassing around the Syrians, right? I mean, how cool would that be? And the Apostle Paul talks about how we are living in a spiritual battle that we can't see. That's what Ephesians 6 talks about. There's a spiritual battle waging around us that we can't see with our physical eyes, but it's there, and it's a battle over our soul. And when you think about like 2 Kings 6 and you think about Ephesians 6, I mean, you can almost let your mind wander like a sci-fi movie or something. It's just really interesting and cool. I'm not making anything up. Read it yourself. But anyways, and I mean, imagine like they've got this army circling the city. They blow the trumpets. The horses start coming down right from the mountains. Everybody's screaming, and all of a sudden the horses start like running into each other, right? And the guys like pull back on the reins, and like they're blind. And they go up to Elisha, and Elisha says, "Here, let me show you guys where we're going." And so he takes them to Samaria, the capital city of Israel. And when they get there, their eyes are opened. And the king of Israel, who's I don't know, who's an unimpressive guy, from what we read about in 2 Kings. Should I kill him? Should I kill him, Elijah? Like we're going to kill him, right? We got to kill him, right? Elijah's like, no, we're not going to kill him. They're prisoners of war. Would you kill a prisoner of war? No. Get them some food and send them home. And the guy's like, all right, okay, well, you heard the man. Get them some food and send them home, right? And so they feed them and take them back. And the because of what takes place, there's peace for a while. And so the Syrian army is fed and returned to Syria, and there's peace for a while now that the king of Syria knows. And not only does Elisha have the ability to hear everything he says, even in his inner chamber, but he also has the power to call down blindness upon his entire army at a moment's notice. Maybe you shouldn't send another invasion for a while. Like maybe you should take it easy. And so we'll pick back. Anybody have anything they want to say about comments or questions on anything about 2 Kings 6? No? Got a few more Elisha stories for us to talk about next week, and then we will finish that up next week and probably talk about some miscellaneous prophets that have very short information about in the Old Testament. And then after we finish that up, it'll be time for us to actually begin with the writing prophets. And so if you've noticed, we talked about how there's going to be 3 sections to our course. The first section is going to be the non-writing prophets, which is what we're talking about so far. But soon we'll begin with the writing prophets. Amos is the first writing prophet. I have not decided yet if we're going to do it chronologically or if we're going to do it with the classic breakage of major prophets, minor prophets. If you have a particular preference, let me know, because I'm still making it up as I'm going along. So if you like to do one or the other, just let me know. Thank you so much for a great class. We had a wonderful attendance tonight. Let's keep that up. Let's go ahead and bow in prayer. Dear Heavenly Father, we're so thankful for the many blessings you've given to us. Dear Heavenly Father, please help us to be courageous like Elisha and to be individuals whose eyes are opened to the world around us so that we can see your hand at work in our lives, that we can put our hope and our confidence not in people, but we put our hope and our confidence in you. And dear Heavenly Father, please help us to be individuals who are bold and who are able to take your truth and be able to proclaim that, even when it is unpopular, like the prophets of old. And dear Heavenly Father, we're just so thankful to live under the new covenant, under Christ, who's our prophet, priest, and king. And dear Heavenly Father, help us to be good servants of his and all that we do. Since we pray, amen.